So this one is about version 5.5, not version 5.6 and not version 5.4. So with Adapt for a very long time, we've had a situation where the JSON, as it's laid out here, course, content objects, articles, blocks, and components, and their corresponding models in Adapt in this file, and their corresponding views for those models are all very hard coded. So on disk, you basically have to have these files, and they have to be structured as an object, and the rest of them are a series of arrays containing objects. And each one of these pieces represents a single model in Adapt, including the course object that represents one model. And what this basically means is that the the concept of menus, pages, articles, blocks, components is compulsory in Adapt. It's hard coded not only by the file formats as they sit on disk, the way they're read into Grunt to be checked, the way they're sent to the browser, they're all retrieved by file name. Then when you make a content object, so a menu or a page, it has to have articles, the articles have to have blocks, and the blocks have to have components. So that was version 5.4 and all the way through to version, back through to version 1. That's been the case. Now the only place where that's different is in the components. So you can use this component property to distinguish between the models in the components JSON. So this won't just have a standard model like a block. A block has got one model and one view, and it will only ever render one model and one view. Whereas a component can have the model and view that are defined by this property here, and they come in a pair. So the text component will have a text model and it will have a text view. There is a standard component model where we used to register just views. So graphic used to have just a view, text used to have just a view, and they used to use the generic component model as their model section. But now it's possible using adapt.register to register both a component and a model for each one of these components. So we can see that in, if I go into the components, pick, say, accordion, we can see that there's a registered model and a view for accordion. So in the JSON, when we try and render an accordion, this line here will instruct adapt to go and collect the accordion model and view from the accordion because it's registered accordingly here. Now that's great until you want to change the layout of Adapt, or you want to do something where you don't need all of the nested parents. So you might want a page but no articles or blocks. You might want articles but no blocks. You might want just blocks and components. But that's not possible in Adapt prior to version 5.5. Now 5.5 changes that quite substantially. So the registry is now expanded to include all content models and views. So the content objects can tell Adapt that they want to be want to have a particular model or a view. The pages can tell Adapt that they want to have a particular model or view. The articles and the blocks accordingly. You can just register a new article view or a block view. So that's the kind of client side part of it, where we end up with an extended registry that accounts for all of the content models and views, and not just the component models and views. And as part of that, as an extension to that, you can now define any JSON files you like, and have any model view combinations on each of those objects. So just that quick refresher. So only the components were registered before, and we had a very static file structure with only components able to define their own model views. Right. So that's basically adapt 4, which is this here. You can kind of see that all the components have rendered nicely, and each one has a page, article, series of blocks, and inside the blocks we have the components. And that's driven by the JSON. So you have to have all of these pieces, and then you can define which type of component you want at the end. And we can find the components in the component store. So this is where they end up after having been rendered. You can see accordion assessment results blank. These are all just components. So that's the version 5.4. So version 5.5 So version 5.5, if we start from the foundation, so the course, you can see it now doesn't have articles, blocks, components, content objects. Instead, any JSON file in this EN folder, or if you had a French folder, the FR folder, or DE, the German folder, you can put any JSON you like in here, and you can put any of the content objects, as in objects of content, so articles, blocks, pages, whatever else you want, in any of the files. So the course JSON here is named as it was before. I could have named it anything I liked, but you can see that it doesn't start with an object anymore. It starts with an array. So any of these files can either have a single object in, or they can have multiple objects in an array, and adapt doesn't care anymore. So Grunt will load all of the files that it finds off the disk, load all of the individual objects, and then check their hierarchy according to which parent IDs are defined, as opposed to which files they belong to. So that's the first change. You can kind of see that the course object here is still populated with all of its globals, defaults, and its extensions. But this course JSON also happens to have the first set of children in it. So it's got the presentations component page. You can kind of see over here. So it's got presentation components, it's got a submenu in there, and it's got the assessment, which lives at the bottom here. So the first lot of children have to be listed in order. All the children have to be listed in order. Anytime you list children, you have to have them in one JSON file, and you have to have them consecutively. Otherwise, if I were to put these in different JSON files, the chances are that the order will come out jumbled, because Grunt doesn't know which order to load the files in, and therefore which order the children should be arranged in. So it's best to keep children as a consecutive list in one file, which you can kind of see as I've done here. So each one of these is a content object, and then this is the submenu and the content object that lives in it, and then the various pages and their children as I've laid them out. So in this course, you can see that, let's take the submenu, for example, which is this one, CO7. So in here, I have one page, which will be the typical questions components. And in there, I will have a series of blocks and components. So in CO7, C10, what you'll notice is that going from CO7, we have a page here into CO7, C10. We're going straight from a page into blocks. So adapt now doesn't mandate that you have to have articles, blocks, components in that order. In this particular page, we've got a content object, and inside the article container, we now have a series of blocks because the article is not mandatory. It's driven entirely by the JSON. I've kind of decoupled all of the core models and views so that they don't mandate the children that they have to have. They just do what the JSON tells them to do. And so inside these blocks then are the components that you can see left and right. So this does have a slight problem to it in that the blocks still have tracking IDs on. So when we're saving courses to an LMS, if you have components, you need to have blocks still. In a later version, and probably in version 6, I'll move the tracking IDs from the blocks to the components, and then we can also get rid of blocks. So you could just have a page with a series of components in it, and the components would save and restore themselves because they had the tracking ID on. So it isn't perfect in the minute. There are still a few things to iron out, but the whole idea is that the JSON leads the rendering rather than it being forced into a structure by the core models and views. So you probably noticed that we've got a hotspot menu here. So multi-menu support has been missing from Core Adapt for a really, really long time. Now, a side effect of being able to register any model and view that you like is that we now have a rather extended store. So rather than just having the components in here now, we also have page, we have menu, we have block, article, we also have menus that can go in here, and the same system applies. So as they did before in the accordion, we have a register directive here, which basically says that anytime you see the accordion in the JSON, you need to render an accordion model and view. The same thing now happens for menus. So if we take the box menu, what I've done at the bottom of the box menu is registered the box menu with the box menu view and an extended menu view. So anytime the JSON now says, oh, I want to render a box menu, that's what will happen, is that you'll get a box menu. And likewise, if you wanted to do the same thing with the hotspot menu, you just need to register that at the bottom and specify it in the JSON, and it will render a hotspot menu for you. Now you'll notice that there's two register directives here, and that's because the course object always has a course model with it, so you can't really override the course model. And likewise, a lot of the time the content objects will just have menus in them. They won't have a component or view or model specified on them. So there are two new properties now in the JSON that you can use. You can use component throughout, so you don't just use it on components, you can also use it on blocks and articles and pages and content objects. But if you wanted to be more specific, you could use view, hotspot menu, and then choose the model that you wanted accordingly. So for these two, we're going to assume that we're going to use a course model or a menu model, and that the hotspot menu view. So this allows backwards compatibility essentially for the old style directives. So if you only had box menu installed in the authoring tool, for example, where you can only have one menu installed, and you can't currently change the component property on the content objects, because content objects aren't actually components, they're more like extensions. So menus in the authoring tool are treated as extensions rather than components, so they don't have the same kind of schema that goes along with them. They don't have a schema that is based around each of the items in the JSON. They have a schema that is basically an addendum to the item, like a page level progress. So menus currently exist like this, whereas they probably need to exist as a whole object that you can include. But when we get to that in the next authoring tool, we can have the component box menu, etc., or view box menu, so on and so forth. So let me just show you that in action. The submenu here has view hotspot menu. So what that means is that I'll use the menu model because it's a type menu. And to render, it will use the view hotspot. If I were to change this to component, it would use the hotspot menu model and view. If I were to change it to this, it would use the hotspot menu model, and then it would probably use the box menu view. Because the JSON drives which view and model combination you use, and this means use both the view and model from that particular registry entry. View means just use the view, model means just use the model. You could also do here, and it will choose the appropriate thing from the registry for you, or if you didn't do either, then it would pick the first registered view for the menu, or for the and the model for the menu accordingly. So whatever that may be, if you only had one menu installed, then the box menu would get. So if you only had the box menu installed, you'd get the box menu. So let's put this back. So that's the hotspot menu view. You can see it rendering there. If I were to change that to box menu, you would get the view for the box menu come up accordingly. So it's quite straightforward. It basically follows exactly the same pattern that adapt components have been using for a really long time. Let's have a look. So that was dropping the article. This is rearranging the JSON, having different file names, having that new component store. So it's changed its name from adapt.componentstore to adapt.store, but the original one doesn't still exist. It just points to the new store now, and it has a deprecated warning that comes up when you use it. So all of the old components should just carry on working as they used to. With one exception, I had a bug with a Flipper component yesterday. I'd forgotten to register the, as you can see here, the component model is missing because it's meant to be an abstract model, but some of the older components register a view only, so that they didn't have a fallback model to use. So their type would have been component, and their component would have been in this case Flipper, but there was no component model for it to pick up, so it would fall over. So I have an outstanding PR to register the component model, so that these legacy view only components still carry on working. So are there any questions? Is that clear enough?
Yeah, that's good.
Chuck?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Very interesting.
Cool. So I'll just take you through the load, the way it loads now. So what you notice is that the normal JSON files come through, but there's also a new file here called language manifest. So what Grunt does, when it's going through and checking that all of the objects have the right parent IDs and they are in a nice structured hierarchy, is it will output a language data manifest. So each language folder will now get a manifest. It's in the .js format because some of our courses use .text instead of .json for the end. That's because some web servers and LMSs block .json as an insecure file type, so we have to change the file type to .text. But none of the servers block .js. So this file will always load on the client side, and then inside it will have the .text or .json ending accordingly. But it's just an array of the files that should be loaded. And what that means is the first thing that Adapt downloads is the manifest, and then it goes through and loads each of the files from the manifest. It creates the model for the course object first. So this type course object here is put into Adapt first because it has all of these globals attributes on it, and then all of the subsequent child models get created, and it goes through a boot up process where all the models are created according to their type and their model definition or component property that's on there. And then after that's all happened, the router takes over, picks up the URL, figures out the first content object that it needs to render. So whether that be main course content object, or a submenu content object, or a page content object. So router has got very much simpler now. It just manages content objects. It doesn't care whether it's the course, whether it's a submenu, whether it's a page. It just goes, I know this ID is a content object, and I'm going to render this content object, and then I'm going to render whatever children I'm told to render from there. So it doesn't have to be a series of articles. So the router's got a lot simpler. The data loading has got slightly more complicated, but actually the code is a lot simpler because it's just following the same pattern over and over again, where it has to discern the model from the type that it's given, and it has to discern the view from the properties that it's given. It's simpler but much more effective, and it means that as we move forward, Adapt is kind of split into different architectural layers, where you have the build tools, grunt, you have the data files that you can put in, the assets, the rest of it. Then you have the basic part of the client side, which is Adapt Core, and then all of the plugins that you choose to put in on top of that. So we might later on split out the menu page, article block, and component from the core, so that you could just have the core and you could put your own abstraction in. So if you wanted a left and right scrolling page, you could do that in Adapt now. You could just replace the page view with something else, or replace the page with an entirely new type of content object that you wanted. It becomes much more fluid and much easier to mess around with. So we go back into this article, this page. What I've got in here is a horizontal page. So this is a prototype that is basically an extension of the page model and the menu model. So you can see the page model is just, it's got nothing in it, but the page view is now extended with some left and right buttons and some other bits. So this is registered as horizontal page. So if we were to go and pick out this page, which is CO7, and we were to change this over to horizontal page, what should happen now is it will pick up the model and view from this extension, and it will render that instead of the normal page. So this is not a page as we're used to it. This is our horizontal page. And so the buttons, you can see, kind of scroll the blocks back and forth, which kind of opens the door up to doing horizontal scrolling pages. You obviously wouldn't have the UI looking like this. It's just a prototype to show what it looks like, or what is possible. But you could see how easy it was. I just basically made an extension with a model and a view in it. I registered it, and then I used it in the JSON by specifying which component I wanted to use. I could also have just done it with the view, because the model is still a page model essentially. So I would have chosen the page model if I'd have done it like that. Both the page model and the page view.
Ollie, can you jump to that plugin and show us how it's being registered?
Sure.
In the JavaScript.
So you can see here that we've got a new class, horizontal page. We've got articles with blocks in still, the page with blocks in and no articles again. So this is exactly the same page as was rendered before. So the registry for this extension, which is actually a component, but it's a page component rather than a block component. So traditionally in this folder, we'd only ever have block components, but this is actually now a page component, and it's registered in exactly the same way that all of the other components are registered.
Ollie, I don't know if you're showing us a different page. I know my screen is not showing it. I'm seeing the network tab, and I'm seeing course CO7 children.json. Am I misunderstanding?
What can everyone else see? Can you see a?
No, I'm the same. I can only see that. Yeah.
Oh.
I can see CO10, so it's working okay on mine.
Okay, let me just restart the screen share then.
I love what you're saying, and I understand the concept. I just wanted to
Sorry, yeah, I didn't
confirm
realize
what I would be imagining in the
I
JS.
didn't realize the screen wasn't updating. Sorry. Can you see now what is
Yes.
on the screen?
Yeah. Yep.
So this is the horizontal page extension. It is structured exactly the same way that a component would be. So you've got the view and the model. The model extends page model. The view extends page view. It's registered in the same way that, for example, an accordion would be registered. So you can kind of see that the difference between these two pages is negligible. And then in order to use that, you do the same thing that you would do with an accordion. You just specify the name that you want to use. So in this case, I'm registering this CO7 URL slightly wrong, but the you can kind of see that I've got a horizontal page rendering up here now.
Mm-hmm.
Because of changing the component. So components in Adapt Now don't just refer to block components.
Right.
Components refer to the view model combination for each one of the JSON objects.
Right.
Okay, so you don't have to add that in. In this case, it would just take the model and the view from page, which happen to be the core model and view for page. So that's how the JSON looks currently. If you want to use a different model view combination for a page, you just do it exactly the same way as you would a component. If you wanted to use the page model, because you've got type page, and you wanted to use a different view, you could just specify the view like this. And you would basically end up with the same thing because we're using the page model with a horizontal page view. And so that's now available throughout all of the parts of the course. So if I would
you provided great flexibility with that. As a comment, the use of that name component as the property name, yeah, that's going to be a little bit of a hurdle getting people up to speed on this and understanding, because it's going to be confusing. But that's meant not so much as a criticism as just a point, a note.
Yeah, it was difficult for me as well, because I had wanted to change it to something else. But obviously changing it means that it would break the components as a starter. But my solution to it essentially is just a mental backflip. So rather than thinking of components as block children, if you just think of components as any model view combination that you can define in the JSON.
Yes.
Yeah,
and I think that's reasonable. We just need to redefine in our minds how we are treating these things with version 5.5. But we still are using there in the tree some old words such as extension and components and menu and theme. The distinction is still what it had always been, is that extensions are used across the course.
Yeah, so so obviously in a later version of Adapt, those folders are going to go missing.
Okay, great.
So all of the plugins will just end up in one source folder.
Okay, gotcha.
So you have plugins, and then you have essentially two different types of plugins. I know we have, what is it, 4 folders: menu, theme, menu, extension, and component. Now the distinction between them is very specific and yet not very well defined. So a component is traditionally a block child that has a menu view and represents one of these objects in the JSON. An extension is an extension to one of these content objects. So these objects of content. So for example, you can see here that the hotspot menu is actually an extension. It's not a piece of content. It should be a piece of content. It should be a component, the menu. but it's actually an extension, and the theme is an extension, and the extensions are extensions. So at the moment, extensions, menu, and theme have the same schema type, so they extend a piece of content. They're just compiled in one after the other. So the theme is always compiled last, the menu second to last, and the extension is third to last, even though they all behave the same way. What I'm suggesting, what I've actually done here, is made the menus components. So the menus will still get compiled later, but you should now register them as you would components, because they form the main body of content. So anything in the main body of content, the content object, the article, the block, the component, should be driven by the JSON. And so each one of those should have a content schema, so that it defines the whole object here. And the reason for that is that the JSON is laid out like that, and the way it renders is laid out like that. So when we start from the course JSON, the first object in the course is always course, but it defines a piece of content. It defines a title, it defines a body, it defines, you know, all of those other parts. So it itself should have a model and view that are rendered for it, and traditionally it did, but they were core models and views, and you couldn't override them. What I've done is just taken the step forwards of being allowing people to override the course content object, page, article, and block models and views in the same way that the components could have been done before, and breaking apart that tight coupling so that the children aren't mandated on the parent. The relationship is now broken. So it all carries on rendering as it would do if you just structured the JSON as you normally would. So if you structured it as course, content, objects, articles, blocks, components, and kept all of that stuff in. So that abstraction of building a course, the ABC abstraction, isn't now a hard-coded, tightly coupled, mandated thing in Adapt. It's now a thing you can do in Adapt. And so that's kind of the direction that I'm going to take the framework in, because it drastically simplifies what we're doing with each piece of information. So with each of these objects in each of these JSON files, they're now all treated exactly the same way. There isn't any distinction between them in terms of a hard-coded thing, except for the content objects are what is a root piece of content. So the content object is the thing that the router ID refers to, and from there it renders children. So you'd only have one content object on screen really at a time, which gives them some special significance. And components at the other end, as we would traditionally think of them, they're kind of leaf components, accordion graphic. They're the kind of final thing, so they don't have any children to them. You couldn't say I want to render a hot graphic inside an accordion, because they're leaf. I mean, they're leaf components at the end. So the idea is that we have root components, which are essentially content objects, and we have leaf components, which are the traditional components that we had before, and the stuff in the middle is as fluid as you want it to be. So you could just render components straight inside content objects, or you could have articles and blocks if you want. And it means we can do all kinds of basically really interesting stuff, and we can simplify the core all at the same time. So in an upcoming version of Adapt, what's basically going to happen is that the menus move from being extensions to models. So you can see that this schema extends the course model, it extends the content object model, so that's all pages and submenu objects. What this will look like is a bit more like the accordion one, where you actually define the JSON that you want for that particular item of content, rather than it being an extension. But extensions will stay the same, and themes will stay the same. They'll both be extensions to these other models. Yeah, I hope that's clear. I know it's difficult to move from kind of expanding the definitions of these things, but the idea is that it just becomes a lot simpler than it currently is.
Oh yeah, it works. I think it's just a matter of how we explain it to folks and how it's presented. Just need to make the distinctions. I interrupted your flow. Seeing as I've done that, can I ask you a question about the language data manifest? Did
Yeah.
you, I missed it. Is that something that the developer puts together, and is it necessary only when these are text files?
No. So the language data manifest is just produced as standard by Grunt now.
Okay, super.
So what Grunt does is it goes through all the language folders and it finds all of the JSON, whatever the ending we've got. So you can change the file ending in Grunt, but by default it's JSON. So in this case, it will just go and get all the JSONs and it'll stick them in a file as an array.
Sure.
And then the first thing the client side does is load the language data manifest, and then it loads all of the files that are specified in the language data manifest. So rather than these file names being hard coded in the framework now, they're just defined with a new step in this file. And it means that we now, and the data loader on the client side and in Grunt, we don't have to hard code a whole load of file names. We just say all of the stuff that's in the language data manifest is all of the data for the course.
Right.
Load it all in and either render the models for it, or check it for hierarchical validity or whatever else we want. It just becomes a hell of a lot simpler. And it means that we can start adding as many like new file types or new model types as we wanted in here. So if you really wanted to go full on bespoke with Adapt, you're not any more confined to page, article, menu, block, and component, or that file structure for that matter that we had before. But they all carry on working as they did before if you just carry on using them as they were before. So multi-menu support basically just follows the same pattern as components. You could just change the type of definition that you've got in the particular file. So for example, here I've registered the hotspot menu as a menu view combination, and I've just used it in the model in the JSON as I would. Multi-menu support, and then obviously like replacing any model view in Adapt leads on from that. So it's not really adding multi-menu support as a feature in its own right. It's more as a kind of consequence of the being able to register any model and use it any way you like. Whereas the original Kineo menu controller that we had actually had a separate registry for menus. So this is where the concept came from originally. And you could kind of see that we made a whole separate registry rather than using the component store that would have it's basically the same pattern, but it's now extended in Adapt as default. So that's all of that stuff. The other large change that went into v5 that's very much separate from what we've just been talking about is content object animations. So if you noticed while I've been going through this course, as I move from the course object into the first content object, you can see that the course slides in. I don't know how well that's coming across on the screen share, but let me assure you that the pages are actually sliding in left and right as you move backwards and forth. So what facilitates this is that everything in a content object, so all of the articles, blocks, and components inside this particular content object CO5 are created as one and then destroyed as one. So what used to happen in Adapt was that when the URL changed, a global remove event would fire off for all of Adapt, and each one of these separate views would listen to that global remove event and it would destroy itself. And what that meant is every time the URL changed is that the page got destroyed immediately. The page, all of its content, the articles, blocks, components, they all just got destroyed. And so when you're trying to do page transitions, so the URL changes and you want to load up a new page and you want to transition the old page out, it was impossible because that old page had already got destroyed as soon as the URL was changed. What now happens is all of the content in the page, so all of the models that are represented in the JSON, they all listen to their own content object. So all of the articles listen to the content object, all of the blocks listen to the content object, all of the components listen to the content object. So when the content object is destroyed now, all of its children get destroyed with it. And what that means is that we can, when we change the URL, we can prevent the destruction of the last content object. So there's a couple of properties inside adapt now that allow you to prevent the destruction of content objects. So adapt should destroy content objects, aptly named. If that's set to true, it will carry on doing what it used to do. It will destroy the content object, and it'll move on to rendering the new one. If you change that to false, you'll just get content objects stacked up one after the other. So it won't actually destroy the last content object that you had on the page. It'll just render the next one underneath it. So if I turned off the content object transition extension that's in here, and I kept that property as false, what would happen is that the menu would render, then the presentations component page would render underneath it, and so on and so forth. Let me just try and demonstrate that for everyone. Let's turn off that extension. So this should take us back to classic adapt, where you can see there's no scroll. It's a content object destruction, loading screen, and a new content object. If I go and change that adapt property, if I were to click here now, what you'll see is that the menu renders then the presentation. So we can now have more than one content object on screen at any one time. Equally, if I were to do the assessment page, it will be presentation components, then assessment. Now what this allows us to do is have an extension that selectively destroys the previous parent view when it wants to. So that's what the content object transition extension does, which is I've got a proposal in the framework for moving that over to the Adapt Learning repo now, but it currently lives in the Kineo one. And it's a very simple extension. Most of it's less driven. So what happens is the extension just changes some classes, and those classes then apply the animations that are required. So here you can see there's a translate x minus 100 and plus 100, and a small scale in and out. Excuse me. Just have a cough. And so the rest of this extension kind of does what you'd expect it to do. It turns off the destroy content objects. There's also a new property called should content object scroll to top. So that prevents adapt from naturally scrolling up when the page renders. There's a couple of other minor hacks with the way routing works that need changing. But other than that, when the URL changes, when you scroll, it basically just goes and changes some properties to do an animation, and then after it's finished, it clears up the outgoing content object, so it destroys the content object that just went. So what you end up with is page transitions. And you can see that the scroll position will be kept. So when I go back to the menu, but this is just behavior that I put in the prototype for this. It's really nice on mobile because when you go forwards and backwards, you basically end up in exactly the same place that you left off. So if I leave the media here, go back to the menu, come back to the page, you see the media's there again. Whereas if I visit the page afresh, it always goes to the top. So if I click on the actual view button, it takes me to the top. Whereas if I use the navigation buttons, it will take me back where I left. So that's the other thing. That's about the only thing in Adapt v5.5 that is fully working, except for and kind of usable in a use case that's meaningful, except for the fact that I really need somebody to sort out the less for me, because I'm really not very good at writing less. But then in terms of the file structures and the model view registrations, I mean, a lot of that's not really helpful for anybody in Adapt at the moment. It's just a necessary step to where we need to end up in kind of version 6 and 7 and 8, in basically normalizing the way the schemas work, the way the source folder is structured, flattening the plugins, simplifying the router, kind of getting these different remove events in for content versus UI. So the UI, like the drawer, for example, still uses the global remove event because that's user interface. So when you change the URL, the user interface should immediately update. But the content objects, as I said, now have a separate remove hierarchy, which allows you to maintain multiple content objects and all of their children on screen at any one time. So you could do like an alt tab if you wanted to in Adapt now, where you just kind of flop backwards and forth between different pages. Not that you'd ever want to do that with a piece of e-learning, but it's now possible. And I think that's it. I think that's the end of v5.5.
Cool. Lovely. Thank you, Ollie. That was all very clear and very good. Any more questions?
No, that was fantastic. Thanks, Ollie.
Yeah, very helpful.
Yeah.
Cool. We'll have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.